Welcome back to CFO Weekly, where we're talking with financial leaders about how to build efficiency in their teams, create time for strategy, and ultimately get results. With your host, Megan Weiss. Let's jump right in.
Today, my guest is Liz Barhydt. Liz is the CFO of Directive Consulting, a SaaS-specific performance marketing agency, and the founder of She Speaks Numbers, a coaching and consulting firm that empowers finance and accounting professionals to drive change, inspire action, and elevate their message through strategic storytelling and effective communication. Liz holds her master's in accounting and a BS in finance, both from Wake Forest University. With over 15 years of experience in corporate finance, she's led many executive teams to increase their financial confidence, business acumen, and financial literacy. Her ability to break down strategic corporate finance into simple, digestible, and actionable steps has enabled many of these companies to grow profitably, scale rapidly, and successfully exit. Liz is a certified management accountant as well as an inactive certified public accountant. Liz, I really appreciate you taking the time to be here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to do this.
Yeah, so when we think about storytelling, we often think about made-up stories and not accounting, but storytelling can play a role in the world of finance and accounting too. Storytelling can be critical in giving context and meaning to the numbers and facts that finance and accounting professionals work with every day. But it's not something many of us think about, let alone practice. So Liz, I'm looking forward to your experience and your advice on how to become a better storyteller. Let's start at the beginning. Tell me about your career progression and how you got to where you are today.
My path to CFO was definitely not your very typical straight-lined path that one may typically take. It started out pretty typical. I did the 5 years master's program when I was in college for accounting and finance. I then obtained my CPA kind of as part of the program, and then it just funnels you right into Big Four public accounting at EY. And so it started out very traditional. However, a couple years in, I just started looking for something a little more fulfilling. I really did have a creative aspect that I've always had, and I wanted something that felt like I could fulfill that creative energy. So a few years later, I left the corporate world entirely to become an entrepreneur, and I was trying to build a cookie company. It turned out to be a place where I could really exercise my creativity as well as apply some of the business knowledge that I had picked up, and I also had a ridiculous sweet tooth, so it was a win-win. The cookie company saw some local success, but after about 5 years or so working 20 hours days and just baking nonstop, we did decide it was time to shut the doors, and I entered back into the corporate world, and I found myself back in accounting again through consulting. But after, being back in accounting after that entrepreneurial experience and being really knee deep in business, it really gave me a whole new perspective on the value of having a really strong finance and accounting function within business. And I kind of had this mindset shift where, as opposed to being a finance person working within the confines of a business, I really began to see myself as more of a business person working from the perspective of finance, and realized what a tremendous and huge value having that perspective is to any business. And I was actually really able to start honing and developing this skill of applying this more creative and strategic bent to financial reporting when one of my consulting clients, I had been consulting for a few years after shutting down the company, recruited me to come in-house as they were just rapidly growing and really needing to build out internally their finance and accounting function from nothing. So I came in to really build an entire department from nothing. And I spent not only a lot of time, obviously, building, strong accounting processes, internal controls, and building out an actual team, but I also spent a lot of time educating the management and leadership teams on just, strategic value of having this internal now strong financial department, applying some business acumen as well as financial literacy to the management team, and how critical of a skill that would be for them as we were scaling and growing and really trying to do some really big things. So that was where I really was able to kind of incorporate this financial storytelling piece that I just really enjoy now into just a traditional accounting and financial function. So eventually the founders exited that business. We were acquired by a PE-backed platform company. Post-acquisition, I stayed on for about 8 months to just support the integration. And then eventually I did transition off. I took a little time, and then a few months later, an advisor that we had used at that startup called me up to bring me in to help another rapidly growing company kind of do the same thing that we just did. And that's how I landed here at Directive as their CFO.
Wow, what a great story. I always find like it's so interesting that, as you move throughout your career, your network is what opens so many doors for you.
Yes. Yeah, 100%. I always kind of say that too, with like most of my moves have been very organic. There's only a few far in between where it's been more, me pushing and very intentional. Most of them have been pulled where an opportunity kind of opened up and, I walked through it. So that works 100%.
So are there any particular stories or moves that stand out in your mind as turning points throughout your career?
Yeah, kind of what I was just talking about at that one startup, that's where I definitely think was a big turning point because I had that mindset shift and I really started enjoying the strategic aspect of business and really trying to level up my business acumen. And not only that, but really improving and working on communication and leadership, all those soft skills that you just don't really learn when you're taking your accounting 101 classes and all the technical aspects. That's really part of what builds really great leaders is, have some of those soft skills. And so that is where I was able to practice and work through that. That's also where I started just really trying to create financial presentations that engaged and compelled action and wanting to kind of, come outside of the box that is typically thought of in a finance presentation that can be a little dry, can be a little dull, and just wanting to make that more engaging. We also had a pretty strong culture of financial transparency. It was definitely something that we wanted to push, but we also felt that if we were going to, really incorporate financial transparency and share numbers with the entire organization, we wanted to couple that with good education and literacy, so they actually knew what the numbers meant and they knew like the stories behind the numbers. So, I spent a lot of time doing both, like not just sharing, but then also educating on what that actually means so that it wasn't, sharing numbers that nobody understood and took in a different context than what they actually meant.
Yeah, I feel like maybe 2 decades ago, finance and accounting was so siloed, and today it's becoming more and more important that it's not just a siloed function, and that finance and accountants can speak the language of the rest of the business.
Yes, absolutely.
So, what does your current organization do?
So Directive is a performance marketing agency. We very specifically serve SaaS companies. We actually have a mission to help over 15,000 SaaS marketers be better marketers, drive growth, and just generate better return on their marketing dollars. So we actually spend a lot of time and energy and money being like thought leaders in this space and educating those that are in the SaaS marketing space, as well as just serving SaaS companies as their marketing agency to run any sort of paid performance they have going on digitally.
And tell me about your experience and how it plays into your journey as an accountant. In other words, the external or internal influences, or maybe both, and how they've impacted you.
Yeah, so I think we are just kind of talking about this, where like most of the doors that I've walked through in my career have opened organically with, a few exceptions here and there. So basically just meaning, when an opportunity is presented, just my more inclination is to say yes, and we'll figure it out when we do there. I'm but definitely more of a risk taker in that aspect. There's certain things I don't take risks on, but in like the ability to I'm always up for the challenge has kind of been my nature. So I can't say that everything I've ever said yes to has ended up swimmingly, but I do think each of those experiences has led me to just having a very vast knowledge of experience. I've had different opportunities. I've seen a lot of things. I've tackled a lot of challenges. And through each of those, obviously have resulted in growth and learnings. And so, I think, I can't remember exactly what study it was, and maybe we'll have to look it up after this, but there's all these like problem solving and being able to think more creatively and thinking outside of the box where they've, come up with the conclusion that the more diversified your experiences, or even the more diversified, like the people that are providing input in. So if you're having like a brainstorming session, having people from diversified backgrounds and having different perspectives, right? Like it just creates a much more productive and fruitful like problem solving. So I really think, because like if you look at, right, my path, it's been kind of all over the place. There's like internal audit, there's public accounting, there's corporate finance, there's, controller accounting, entrepreneurship, it's been kind of not a straight line. And yet I do believe a lot of those experiences has been just valuable learning lessons.
Yeah. So what does it mean to you to be a storyteller when it comes to finance and accounting?
Oh, yes, I love storytelling. So what that means to me is if you are using stories to tell numbers or share financials, you're communicating numbers or financials or data really in a way that makes it easy for people to listen to. People actually understand your point, like what your message actually is. And then in turn, when they hear your story, want to take some sort of action. So basically, you're creating this shift from just sharing information and sharing awareness and, making people aware of what's happening to actually compelling action. So, I believe when you're able to kind of weave the storytelling into the numbers, you just make it easy for people to connect. And then the numbers actually have meaning and drive, value to help companies move forward.
Yeah. When I was researching this topic, I came across a study, and I can't remember it exactly, but it was something along the lines of like people can remember a story like 80% of the time or something like that. Whereas a fact, maybe they might remember 1 out of 10 facts that you present.
Yes. I think it's like 22 times more too. They remember that and it sticks with them than a fact.
Yeah. So when presented with financial information, how do you go about finding the story behind the numbers?
Finding the stories behind the numbers, I think, requires a lot of listening and asking a lot of questions. So I typically go through a lot, like a list of questions I just have when I'm looking at numbers to try and understand exactly what's happening. And, these are questions like what's exciting or what's scary, what's something that you can see looking at these numbers that maybe is not widely known across the organization, or especially, when you're trying to align the stories that you share in the financial data you're presenting with the vision or the mission of the company, you're looking for the things that may not align. If you're seeing something trend in a way that is taking us further from the goals we're trying to achieve, those are the stories that you're trying to look for. So it definitely starts with asking a lot of questions. But I also think the first place too to start is you kind of have to get out behind your spreadsheets and get out and start having conversations and engaging with others within the organization that work in different functions. And it definitely may feel uncomfortable. I know you and I were just talking about being accountants and how, getting out and having to tell stories is probably not our most favorite thing to do, but it definitely helps you have more context when you're looking at the numbers to look at them through like a more strategic lens, because you can just start to understand like what's really happening. So right after E&Y, I had worked for a nonprofit in DC as an internal auditor. And the internal audit function for this nonprofit wasn't your standard like internal audit of internal controls or operations, but we were actually auditing contributors of the fund that we were managing. And when we first began auditing our fund, the contribution numbers had been declining year over year. And a lot of the stories that were told internally within the organization with this is just kind of part of the natural contribution cycle and, nothing to really do about it. However, as we began our audits and we got out into the field and we started actually talking to the contributors, a really different story actually emerged. And it just turned out that the rules were so complicated that they didn't even understand how they were supposed to be contributing and had been under contributing because they were just too complicated for them to understand what to contribute, which was like so different than what was told. And so like, had we never gone out, had we never like started engaging and having conversations, we never really would have been able to put the right story with the numbers.
Yeah, that story definitely emphasizes the importance of getting out and speaking to other departments.
Yeah, and it's like you just said, like we can't operate in our silos anymore.
Yep.
I think the more a finance department can be a part of operations and understand, how the business is functioning, just the better we'll be able to play in our roles.
So similarly, how do you translate complex data, like you just mentioned, into easy to understand concepts for finance or for non-finance professionals?
So I think a great storytelling technique, and it's not your traditional stories of, beginning, middle, end, or big hero conflict type stories, is really the use of analogies. And it's, the ability to take a complex or complicated concept and think through it in a way that is just much more relatable. I'm sure we've all been in situations where someone's trying to explain something to us and then they share it in the term of analogy and it just clicks and you're like, oh, I get it. Those analogies just make things so much more relatable. And what we're really trying to do when we're using stories is help people connect, help people just feel something with what we're saying. And part of that is that understanding and the relatability. So I definitely think it's one of the skill sets that if we are presenting financials, especially, any sort of more complicated financial pieces, trying to think through that in the terms of an analogy is really, really helpful. I have an example too.
Sure.
So one thing I was thinking of when I was thinking of analogies is, when I was presenting financials for the entire company. So, at a very high level, majority are non-finance people, but, like I said, we wanted financial transparency. And so we wanted, to make sure we were sharing these, I used analogies a lot. And there's one analogy I specifically remember because I got a lot of feedback about it, and that a lot of the department managers would then use that same analogy when they had to motivate their teams or talk about the goals or the metrics that they were trying to shoot. And we were talking about customer retention and how important it was for our company to focus on retention. We had a recurring revenue business model, so that retention piece was critical to our success. And I used the analogy of throwing a house party, and I put it on my deck and I had it music playing with this big house party. And we just kind of talked about how, if you're trying to throw this great big house party, but as many people are coming through the front door, if just as many people are sneaking out through the back door, your party is never going to grow. And it's not like customer retention is this incredibly complex term that you can't understand, but even just using that analogy just made it more memorable, right? People remembered that, and then they could remember, this is a goal of ours. We really need to focus on it. So yeah, analogies, I think, are so powerful.
Definitely. That's great advice. And I know we've touched on this a bit with stories being more meaningful and memorable, but why do you think storytelling is a useful or crucial skill when it comes to finance and accounting?
Yes, especially for this field and for this industry. I think the rise of data automation and AI, some of the hard and technical skills of a finance and accounting professional just won't be sufficient enough to be relevant. I think just the more technology becomes a part of our everyday lives, and at a certain point in our career, those hard skills just no longer keep you moving forward. And we kind of talked about it. It's really those soft skills that are really required for you to continue to drive value, continue to even communicate your own worth and your place in any organization. So I think stories can really help with that. And I also think, it's not something that's necessarily expected of a finance and accounting professional, and it's definitely not required in our roles, but I don't know how long it will stay that way. I mean, I really think that, the more we're able to kind of communicate what the numbers actually mean to move businesses forward is kind of where this function in this field is kind of taking. So yeah. Definitely it's important, I think, especially when you think about how much time you spend, putting together numbers, analyzing numbers, and then we're spending time communicating them. Why not communicate them in a way that actually impacts behavior?
Yeah, I mean, even when you look at technology these days, it's all kind of leading us towards a path of being a storyteller.
Yeah. And that's how we connect, right? I mean, I think it's so interesting because COVID's obviously drawn this out so much more where people really crave connection, and stories really help you connect to people and feel just closer. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so storytelling it's often considered a creative skill. And as we've touched on, many accountants might not relate to being creative or wanting to put themselves out there in that way. So what skills do we need to develop or hone?
So, yeah, kind of like we talked about with listening, which I think accountants probably are really good at, and getting out there, having conversations, listening for the stories, being intentional when you hear one to like pick up on, oh, I just heard a story. Like that's a good one. So part of that also is I think, I recommend starting a story vault, which could be an Evernote or a note app, wherever you feel comfortable just jotting something down whenever you hear a story or something just resonates with you or you think it has a good point. Like that's a great and simple and easy way for you to start to develop this skill, because before you know it, you'll have, created this habit of recognizing and seeing and listening for stories. And the more you do that, you start to see like they're everywhere. Every day you probably encounter, multiple stories. And now you're just creating that habit of recognizing it. And then you also are creating, a little back pocket of stories so that when a situation comes up where a story could be really impactful, really meaningful for you to share and exercise your voice, you already have this really great resource involved of just stories that you've collected to bring up. Paul Smith, he's like a storytelling trainer. He has worked with tons of businesses and building leaders to just tell better stories. But he actually had this challenge where he said he gave himself like 30 minutes every day at the end of the day to just write down like 3 stories that he saw that day. And that's just a great little habit that you can start creating because, the more you're starting to recognize them, the more you're able to start to use them. And then I would say, definitely start small. I think storytelling is a skill that can be really intimidating, but even if it's in your next meeting or in your next presentation, looking for that opportunity to just share a quick, relevant story, the more you start to do that and the more you raise your hand to share here, just the easier it becomes. It's absolutely a muscle. And the more we practice it, the easier it gets.
And what about those people that might say, oh, I'm too shy or too much of an introvert to actually be a good storyteller?
I would actually argue that you're a better storyteller because, like we've been talking about, the biggest skill of storytelling is the listening piece and, listening for the stories. And I think that's such a critical skill. And typically, if you're an introvert, you're a really good listener. You're good at observing and, contextualizing things. And so I do think it's a common misconception that only extroverts tell good stories. Maybe if the purpose of a story is to entertain or be funny, then sure, maybe extroverts have an advantage there. But when, we're talking about these strategic financial stories, we're not telling them for entertainment purposes. We're telling them for a purpose. We either want to drive change or communicate strategy or inspire vision. And so introverts are actually like more contextual. They're more deliberate. They're very intentional. And I do think that's actually a quality that would make you a better storyteller, especially in this context, because you can be incredibly purposeful for when you're sharing stories.
Yeah, that's great points. You're right. I mean, introverts are great listeners and very good at observing things that are going on around them.
Yeah.
So are there any tools or technologies that you've implemented to help translate financials into pictures or stories?
Yeah, in a lot of my prior organizations, we definitely use a lot of dashboards.
Uh-huh.
We use a tool called Clipfolio because it's so simple, but any, Depth of Insights, Tableau, any of those data visualization tools, I think are really helpful. I think the default is to just throw a ton of stuff up there. So obviously, part of that is creating a skill of ensuring what you're sharing is relevant and meaningful and people know what to do with it. But dashboarding, I think, is incredibly powerful to have it shared across an organization, especially as real time as you can get it, because it definitely keeps, the goals and the metrics and what everybody's, working towards front and center. And then, I think one thing that I try to share when I work with, finance and accounting professionals that are trying to hone this skill is, I think something that happens for a lot of us when we go to craft our financial presentations, by default, we'll kind of pull up prior period's deck and we'll just start updating those numbers. And something that I would just always typically challenge is to not start your presentations that way, but to actually think through first, what's the message I want to share? What's the purpose of sharing these numbers? And what is my goal for even having this presentation? And when you can think through those first, then you can craft a much better presentation that has more meaning than if you're just kind of going through the motions of updating prior periods numbers.
Definitely. That is some great advice. And then lastly, so as we start off 2021, what's one goal, either personal or professionally, that you're hoping to achieve this year?
Yeah. So 2020 is over. I'm very excited that 2020 is over. So, one goal that I do have personally is, something I think that that happened because of, 2020 was just, and you can see a lot of the statistics around, female leaders, especially moms in the workplace, is really disheartening. So one of the goals I have is just to kind of build better community for female finance leaders and, making sure that we're supporting each other. So just building my network, building relationships there is what I have for my personal goal. But professionally, Directive, we've got some really strong, aggressive growth goals this year, especially coming out of 2020. We ended up doing a lot of changes prior year, some COVID related, some not, but it was really trying to position us really well for strong growth this year. So, they're definitely aggressive and they will take a lot of that collaborative execution from multiple aspects of the team. So one thing that is really cool about it is that, me sitting in the finance seat and having the finance perspective, I get to ensure that all of our efforts are aligned and we're all moving towards our common goal. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's great. And I guess if anything good came out of 2020, it's that we made some changes that will put us in a better position for the future.
Yes, 100%. Yep. It definitely just accelerated probably things that needed to be addressed eventually. So,
yeah. Liz, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. That was fun.
Yeah, I've enjoyed speaking with you and getting your perspective on how we can become better storytellers and add more value to our organizations. To all of our listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this episode as well, and please tune in next week. Until then, take care of yourselves.
If you're ready to boost efficiency and streamline your accounting processes at significant cost savings, it's time to talk with Personiv. Their people-powered solutions have transformed the delivery of back-office tasks and general accounting functions for decades, partnering with clients to provide everything from accounts payable to payroll services. See what Personiv can do for you by visiting personiv.com.
You've been listening to CFO Weekly, presented by Personiv. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to hear all of our episodes. Want to learn more? Check out personiv.com. Thanks for listening.